I bought a GTX 780 Ti in 2024 and a part of me kinda wishes I didn't. But for nostalgia's sake, I paid just £40 for this Founders Edition or reference model GTX 780 Ti. So I'm going to see how well it plays games at 1080p, and I'm also going to show you as to why you shouldn't buy a Kepler graphics card in 2024. Nvidia's GTX 780 Ti was their best graphics card that they released in 2013, and that's when I got into PC gaming and I wanted one of these so badly, but its $700 price tag, well, let's say it was a bit out of budget because it was 3 or 4 times the amount of my whole PC back then, so affording one of these was kind of out of the question. But 11 years on, I'm holding it in my hands, and it's kind of cool to see a GPU you once wanted really bad back in the past in your hands right now, and it's kind of cool to see what it can and can't do as from what we're going to see. But without any more talking, but how well does it play games in 2024? To find out the answer of that question, I've put it in my brand new testing PC, which has a Ryzen 5 7600, 64GB of DDR5 memory, which is running at 5600 MHz. I know 64GB for a gaming PC is very overkill. It's the only memory kit I've got that works in this PC at the moment. A Gigabyte B650M Gaming X-AX motherboard and a 2TB Western Digital SN770 SSD. I've left the GTX 780 at its stock out of the box setting, so no overclocks have been applied today, and I've used the latest Kepler driver. I can't remember the version, so it'll be on the screen somewhere. So let's get straight into the benchmarks. Starting off today with Fortnite, and here the performance on the 780 Ti is actually quite good on the performance API. 377 FPS on average with a 1% low of just over 200 frames per second is really good performance in my book. And if you had a 360Hz 1080p monitor, or maybe a 240Hz, something along those lines, performance in Fortnite is going to be totally fine. Yes, it doesn't look that great on the performance API, but the frame rate is a nice compensation for that. Despite being a DirectX 12 game, Cyberpunk still runs on a GPU like the 780 Ti, and I say runs, it kind of walks, because just over 30 FPS on average it's playable, but it's not the smoothest experience, and the 1% low, in all fairness, was pretty close to the average frame rate. So if you wanted to play Cyberpunk 2077 on a 780 Ti, it is playable, but I wouldn't really recommend it. One thing I could recommend though is The Witcher 3. Yes, this game is getting on a bit now, but CD Projekt Red did remaster it or enhance it recently, and to be fair, it looks quite good, and the performance is decent on the 780 Ti, getting 70 FPS on average with a 1% low of just over 60 frames per second. That means the game runs nice and smooth on the medium preset, and if you've got one of these GPUs lying around in an old machine and you want to play The Witcher 3, it's playable. The GTX 780 Ti seems to shine in esports and older titles, with Rainbow Six Siege running perfectly fine. Just under 200 FPS on average and a 1% low, which is pretty close to it at 156 frames per second, is really good performance in my opinion. So if you've got a 144Hz 1080p panel, Rainbow Six Siege competitive play is certainly possible. A game where competitive play isn't possible is Doom Eternal, because the frame rate was just jumping all over the place, even on the lowest preset. This is a similar issue which I saw with the GTX Titan, which is a video you can watch, it will be linked up below. But yeah, the frame rate is jumping all over the place, getting just below 40 FPS on average with 24 frames per second for the 1% low. That isn't great performance, so I'd recommend against the 780 Ti if you want to play some Doom Eternal. Where I could recommend the 780 Ti though is Counter-Strike 2. This is a notoriously CPU heavy game, and luckily the Ryzen 5 7600's done a good job today. But so has the 780 Ti, getting just over 200 frames per second on average, and the 1% low at 140 isn't particularly brilliant, but as we've seen from Counter-Strike 2 in the past, the 1% lows aren't particularly great in this game. But competitive play is certainly possible in Counter-Strike 2 with a 780 Ti. Last game I'm specifically taking a look at today is Halo Master Chief Collection. With Halo Reach in Firefight, this shouldn't be that much of a worry for the 780 Ti, and good news, it isn't. You're set for a 144Hz experience, getting just below 160 FPS on average. The 1% low does look not particularly great against the average frame rate. However, when I was playing it, it didn't really feel like that much of a problem at all, so I wouldn't really be that worried about the 1% low figure. So Halo Reach looks great on the enhanced preset at 1080p. All things considered, it is a really old game now, but it runs fine on a 780 Ti. In the games that it runs, the GTX 780 Ti really isn't that bad for the most part. Like, look at games like Fortnite and Rainbow Six Siege and Counter-Strike Go, or Counter-Strike 2 now, old habits die hard. The GTX 780 Ti really isn't that bad of a graphics card, and it's somewhat viable for these games. But the biggest problem with this GPU is its lack of driver support and its lack of proper DirectX 12 and even 11.1 feature support. That's right, this will stop it from playing a lot of games, including games like God of War, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, anything which requires any DX 11.1 features and above. This GPU isn't going to run it. And even if you can play a newer title, it doesn't necessarily mean the performance is going to be great. Like, look at Doom Eternal today, that ran absolutely horrendously, which it did on the Titan, which is up there. Which is kind of a shame, because I know if the drivers were properly updated, this GPU should still be quite decent in it, as it is around a GTX 1060, 3 gig levels of performance if the drivers were properly updated, which they can't be because it's Kepler. And that brings me on to the biggest problem with this graphics card, and no matter how powerful it is in terms of raw GPU power, it is still a Kepler graphics card. This is going to be a similar point to what I did with the GTX Titan, and this is because it just doesn't have any modern feature support for the most part. So DirectX 12, you kind of can't really run anything on that. Cyberpunk was a bit of an outlier today, as that does run on DirectX 12, but on the low preset, and you don't enable FSR or anything like that. It's not using any DirectX 12 features, so it will run, and it kind of ran, it walked if anything, but 36 FPS on average is playable in my opinion, but it's just not great. And the fact that Nvidia axed game ready driver support for Kepler based graphics cards in 2021 means you're going to be very lucky if a modern game will even start on one of these graphics cards, which is a shame, because I think the 780 Ti would have been totally fine in a game like F123, as it's relatively lightweight, and yeah, you can't play it because of either the DirectX 12 support or lack thereof, and the lack of new game ready drivers. And this is why I don't recommend any Kepler based graphics card, let alone the GTX 780 Ti in 2024, thanks to its lackluster driver and API support, and the fact that you can find much better value graphics cards even from AliExpress, like the RX 580 2048 SP, which I do have my hands on one, and I will be testing that very soon here on the channel. And that is a GPU I picked up for less than £50, which is like an extra £10 more than what I paid for this, and to be honest, it's definitely worth it. And even if newer games did want to run, its 3 gigabytes of VRAM isn't particularly very great, especially in 2024. So that's why this GPU should be left to the history books, and I'm probably going to keep my hands on this one because it is the first GPU I really wanted, so it's a nice one for the collection, and it's a reference design as well, which I think look pretty brilliant. So if you want to see how its Titan cousin gets on, there will be a video up there. Kind of a spoiler, it's not that great. And there's another GPU video down there if that one suits your fancy more. And I'll catch you in the next one. Have a good rest of your day.